I'd like to introduce Carrina and Jill, who are going to be speaking of stewardship of rare plants on private and regional lands. And I'll hand it over to you, Carrina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thanks to Megan and Lindsay for pulling this whole webinar series together and for the invitation to come and chat with you all. Really appreciate being here today. I'm going to talk about at a relatively high level about stewardship of our plants on private and regional and Indigenous lands. And then I'm going to tag team over to Jill, who's going to talk about a pilot project that we've been working on to have a volunteer-supported rare plant monitoring program in CRD parks. So it'll be a 1-2 punch with this one. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm on Salt Spring Island, which is the traditional unceded territories of the Halkmina and the Senchothan, the Malchosan, Lekwungen, Semiahmoo, and Sioux-speaking peoples. And as probably everyone on the webinar knows, that these First Nations have had a long and extensive and deep history of land management in these ecosystems in the coastal Douglas fir area. Not just cultural burning to keep meadows open, keep shrubs and trees at bay, but also cultivation of species like camas and chocolate lily to aerate the ground, develop increase in crops. So it's been managed for a long time, and Garryoke ecosystems are at an early successional stage, which means that this management by Indigenous people has kept these open landscapes that would have otherwise been filled in, especially in the deeper soils, by conifers and shrubs. So it makes it challenging to keep them open now that we have changed our land management practices quite dramatically and stopped all the fire. So these open Garryoke ecosystems are also home to a lot of species at risk. There are currently 87 federally listed Kosiwik plant, moss, and lichen species in the province that are listed as either endangered or threatened. So BC has the lion's share of rare plants. And we also have a further 706 provincially rare listed plants in BC. So the federally listed plants are listed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife and are then subject to the Federal Species at Risk Act, which involves having critical habitat designated. And then the provincial listing is an internal ranking system that doesn't have a lot of legislative protective teeth behind it. I just want to point out that the BC Conservation Data Center is a really excellent resource, the BC Species and Ecosystem Explorer, for finding the locations of these rare plants. They have fabulous maps with all the occurrences mapped. They have conservation status reports that provide some of the details. And I'd just like to encourage anyone that is doing work associated with species at risk on the ground to reach out to the BC Conservation Data Center directly. What's mapped on these maps are element occurrences, which have the sort of centroid of the location. But if you want all of the details of where all those little patches are within each occurrence, it's really important to reach out to the CDC to get that location data. So if you're working with on the ground things. I just wanted to point out too that the Conservation Data Center does have the ability to mask occurrences. So if there are rare plant locations on private land that private landowners do not want made public, it is possible to have them masked, but that can only be done at the time that the data is submitted and not retroactively. So the photo here is, sorry, Megan, is of a beach bindweed, which is in our coastal sands ecosystems. So I just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of ecosystems with rare plants, not just the Garryoke ecosystems, but Garryoke ecosystems do the heavy lifting for rare plant habitat. So Garryoke ecosystems, as probably most people on the coast are aware, that there's less than 5% of habitat in the coastal Douglas fir moist maritime biogeoclimatic zone that remains intact. And most of what is considered intact, it still faces multiple threats from invasive species and other kinds of degradation. This habitat is home for over 100 plant and animal species at risk, and what remains is under extreme pressure, not just from invasive species, but also recreational pressures, trampling, trail building, all of those kinds of activities. So there's a lot of challenges with managing these really rare ecosystems. And all of the ecosystems or plant communities, as the Conservation Data Center calls them, within the coastal Douglas fir moist maritime have been ranked as being at risk. So they're all under extreme pressure. So I just wanted to point out there was a really interesting article that came out a couple of years ago from Jenny McCune at the University of Lethbridge. And she compiled a lot of the published literature on species at risk and made the point that plants have the least funding, have the biggest knowledge gaps of basic life history, understanding of threats, and have the smallest representation in the conservation biology literature. So we know very little about most rare plants. We have some really basic understanding of some plant pollinator interactions, such as this sand verbena moth, which is federally endangered and red listed, that is really strongly connected to the yellow sand verbena, which is one of our blue listed coastal sand species. So given all of these big impacts to these species, the rarity, what kind of stewardship actions can folks take to try to safeguard these species and maintain the biodiversity? This is going to be pretty high level because the needs of all these species are very different. But the most important thing that can be done is just land protection in whatever form that takes. And I'll go over a few options as we go through these slides. Managing habitat for species at risk with all of the complications and nuances of different species phenology and different habitat needs, and also these huge knowledge gaps. And I just wanted to highlight the photos in the slide are all of coastal manroot, which is a really important plant for Indigenous peoples on the coast. It's known from only 4 locations in Canada, and the old herbarium records from 1958 say that they are from Indian villages and gardens at quite a few sites, at least 2 of the sites, and one of the other herbarium specimens says Indian Lookout. So it's a deeply important, culturally significant plant and also a species at risk. So including Indigenous partners and management for some of these species is deeply important. And then the importance of supporting research and monitoring. So land protection can take various forms, either outright acquisitions, conservation covenants, voluntary stewardship agreements. Pretty much anything that works to get the job done is great. And even though only 5% of the land base in BC is private, almost 40% of the species at risk are on private lands. So that really puts the pressure on non-government to support and protect species at risk. In terms of management of species at risk, it gets really complicated really quickly because of the multiple interactive threats facing species at risk. So the big one is land use changes, which can be addressed by acquisitions and conservation covenants and stewardship agreements. But then there's also the interactions of recreational impacts, trail building, trampling, and then the odd water pipe or outhouse that gets built on species at risk occurrences, invasive plants, wildfires that are now much hotter and more intense, even in these fire adapted ecosystems because there's been fire suppressions for so long. And then the other side of that is the fire suppression and then the conifer encroachment, hyperherbivory, and there's the interactions between all of these that you have. If you set up a fence around a population of rare plants to try to protect it from hyperherbivory, what often happens is you get more encroachment of woody shrubs, trees, invasive species. When you have a fire to try to bring back the the natural ecological regime, then you have invasion by invasive species that quickly colonize this bare ground. So it's a very complicated system to restore, very complicated system to manage for rare plants. And it's really important to know as much as you can possibly know about the species, the timing, what kind of habitat needs they need. So there are some higher level management suggestions. I'm not going to get too into the weeds of the details of managing for species at risk because it is so species specific and site specific. But limiting soil disturbance is really key. Anytime there's bare ground, that's when the weeds start to move in. Controlling invasive species is also really critical, especially shrubby species like Scotch broom and gorse, which also then promote the invasion of non-native invasive grasses, which are much more challenging to control and a much bigger systemic problem. Limiting trails and benches, in part because where people walk, they often bring weeds with them on their shoes, and the trampling can not only damage species, but in some cases, there are some native species that like a little bit of trampling, which makes it all a little bit more complicated too. And understanding the species as much as possible when it blooms, when it goes to seed, where are the bottlenecks with it in terms of reproduction, habitat needs, all of those kinds of questions. And then if there are disturbed areas, to replant those with native plants is really ideal. But the key to stewardship activities is really knowing where those rare species are. And there's been a lot of folks on the ground that have done a lot of work looking for rare plants. On the left, there's Hans Romer, who is an incredible botanist, and I was super lucky to get to spend quite a few of my formative years out in the field with him looking for rare plants. And Ryan Batten on the far right there, who have dedicated their lives to looking at rare plants. The CDC Species and Ecosystem Explorer is a great first step, but you really need on-the-ground surveys to know whether the plants are still there and to be able to understand trends. And unfortunately, the capacity for both federal and provincial governments is incredibly low. This is an Auditor General report that just came out that says at the current level of departmental support at Environment and Climate Change Canada, it would take almost 30 years for the committee to assess the species currently prioritized and over a century to assess those that are potentially at risk. So there just isn't the dedicated support for not just assessment, but also the on-the-ground monitoring. And unfortunately, that means that it can fall to local governments and also to NGOs and Indigenous governments to have to take on the burden of monitoring and knowing where these species at risk are found. And so that brings us to this project that Joel is going to take it away now and talk about the CRD Parks Rare Plant Eco Monitoring Program.
Awesome. Thanks, Carrina. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that I am working in the traditional territories of Lekwungen-speaking people as represented by Songhees and Kasapsan First Nations, and very grateful to be able to work in this area at Mill Hill Regional Park. We initiated this project early this year, and we are really lucky to do that as a really great team. So I worked closely with Carrina, as well as Mike Stefanik and Wiley Thomas. And so we kind of started working together in early January with the intent of basically doing what Carrina is describing, is gathering information on where the rare plants are and using volunteers to support that work. Awesome. And so we really modeled that project or this program after the University of Washington Rare Care Program. Wendy Gibble is leading that program and has an extensive knowledge of the program and how to engage volunteers. And it's a statewide program. So we're really looking to see how we could adapt a similar type of program in British Columbia. And Carrina's ultimate goals is to have a province-wide program. And from a CRD regional parks perspective, we're looking at how can we harness all of the incredible knowledge of volunteers in the area and support our understanding of rare plants in parks. And then hopefully from a regional parks perspective, we can expand that to other taxonomic groups in areas of cultural interest and cultural significance and other ecological indicators within our parks to help inform our knowledge of species, but also our management actions within those parks areas. So ultimately, we developed an eco-monitoring program. And like I said, it was really modeled after the Washington program. And we started with regular meetings with our core team. So that was Carrina, Mike, and Wiley and I. But then that also included many members of the CRD regional park staff team. So our GIS team, our conservation technicians, and our volunteer coordinator. And so we looked at developing something small scale that we could implement as a pilot in 2024. We identified target species. So this year we worked with white top aster, a blue listed species and listed as Schedule 1, special concern. And we originally thought about a species that was blooming in early spring, and we quickly realized that we had a lot of work to do to get the program in place before we could launch it. And so then we looked to white top aster being a later blooming species as our pilot, and something that's really easily identifiable as well, which is really useful from a volunteer perspective. We defined our volunteer base, and that was really important to understand who we wanted to engage in this project. And that was really starting. We wanted to work with people that already had extensive knowledge and experience in this region with rare plants. And so we kind of handpicked folks that we knew had that knowledge and experience in the area, with the hopes that in the future we can expand and broaden and maybe even create like a mentor type program where we can engage other folks that are very interested but don't yet have that knowledge and capacity. We identified what our equipment needs would be, what we needed to provide to our volunteer program. One kind of practical step was just getting a volunteer position approved. So at CRD Regional Parks, we had to get approval from our management team, but also through the HR department and the union to make sure we had a position that was supported by the organization. So that was one small but important hurdle to get past. And then the meat of the program was really developing this handbook. And like I've described, it was modeled after really useful resources and training materials provided by the Rare Care program in Washington, but also a lot of work by folks at CRD and the volunteer program and the conservation technicians and GIS folks, but also our core team. And it ultimately included a basic how-to guide of how to collect data in the field, with the idea being that volunteers would be able to go out independently and collect data on our behalf around numbers of species and potential threats, and taking pictures as well. And so this program that we developed, it also included background on confidentiality and guidelines for tracking your work hours, safety, preparing for your site visit. And then, of course, having environmental mitigations, ensuring that the work that we're doing and having volunteers going out into parks and particularly into sensitive areas where there's rare plants, that they have a strong knowledge of how they can mitigate any potential impacts. And luckily with our core group, they were an extremely knowledgeable group of volunteers that had that knowledge. We also developed a couple apps. And so the one app that we used was Avenza, and that was supporting the navigation into these locations within regional parks. And then we also provided resources to help support navigation. If they weren't using Avenza, there's Gaia and other resources that folks could use. And then we also worked with Kobo Toolbox. That was our core app that we used so that anyone with a smartphone could be adding data that they were collecting in the field and that was being submitted to CRD parks. So in advance of doing this program, launching the program, we provided the volunteers with an information package that included the CDC species report that Carrina alluded to, with all the background information around the occurrences, the element occurrences and the patch locations, and how to get to the site and how to access the site and what's been reported in the past, as well as the eco-monitoring handbook, and then the maps and KML files, so any location maps and geo-referenced maps that we could provide in advance to help them get to the site. And then we did some in-class and in-field training. And so we started with one kind of evening training session with our volunteer coordinator, Nadine, who provided the volunteers with an overview of CRD as a whole and our basic practices and foundational components to the volunteer program with CRD. And then we followed up with a half-day training event at Mill Hill Regional Park, where we really looked to discuss the details of the program, how they collect data, how we identify species, how we conduct our counts, and how you submit that to the CRD, and what kind of details we're looking for. And so we walked through the whole process, both in the classroom, and then we went out into the field, Mill Hill Regional Park, to collect data and kind of do a practice run through with our volunteers. So here we are, the group of us. We had 4 volunteers that came out with us, and then a number of CRD staff and Carrina and Wiley. And we really troubleshooted and worked through the program to kind of understand how it works out in the field. It was kind of our first test with the volunteers, and we practiced submitting data and collecting data and counting and doing a sort of a threat assessment of what we saw in the field. And then ultimately the idea is that we collected that data and then the volunteers were able to go out into the field. And so they went to Bear Hill Regional Park independently and collected data on our behalf and submitted it to us. And we were able to do a review of that data and submit to the BC Conservation Data Center. And I should mention a lot of this work that happened in the beginning of developing the apps and what data we were collecting. We worked with our core team as well as with CDC to make sure that we're collecting data that's most useful and helpful from the provincial perspective as well. Okay, so in 2025, we're continuing to expand the program. We've been working with the volunteers that we've already been supporting the program to get feedback on how it went so far, how we can change and adapt and grow. For 2025, we're looking to expand to another species, purple sanicle, which is currently under reassessment by COSEWIC. So the timing is really great to collect more information and better understand the species. We're also hoping to expand beyond just CRD parks. So this year we're hoping to have Sanage's support to work within Sanage regional or municipal parks. And in the future, we're really, from a regional parks perspective, like I mentioned, I'm hopeful that our volunteer program will expand to other taxonomic groups. I think our group as a whole wants to look to how we can decolonize our process and think about expanding to species of cultural significance. And yeah, continue to work with lots of different partners and expand, from Carrina's perspective, I think expand to the entire province at some point to have a model very similar to what is taking place in Washington. I'll pass it over to Carrina to wrap up for us.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight the point that the working off this rare plant program in Washington, they also use volunteers to go back. So they go out and monitor the rare plants, and then they go back later in the season and collect seed for their ex situ seed bank. And that's another side project that I've been working really hard on, is to develop a BC seed bank to collect not just species at risk seed, but also seed of cultural value as a safety net, so that if there are catastrophic wildfires that wipe out some of these species, we still have the genetic material banked in long-term storage. long-term storage. And one of the real benefits of having an ex situ seed bank is that it can really support a lot of that data gaps in terms of understanding the viability of the seed of these species and doing germination research, which can then feed back into some of these really tricky management questions and restoration and reintroducing new populations and all of that really important work that needs to be done. And with that, I just want to say a big thank you to the CDFCP for organizing the webinar, for inviting Jill and I to speak and letting us share some of the work that we've been doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you, Carrina and Jill. That's very fascinating. And I really appreciate all the photos. They're gorgeous plants, which helps when you have cute stuff. People may be more willing. So yeah, big round of virtual applause. For those that join later, just a reminder, we're going to hold questions until the end. And I'd like to hand it over to Douglas Justice to present your slides, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Um, Before I start, I want to recognize and acknowledge that I live and work on the Hunkaminam speaking uh, territories that are close to the Fraser River, and in particular, I'm right now uh, near where the Fraser River empties out into the Pacific. And uh, the foghorns are now finally drowning out the noise of the sea lions that I can hear that are congregating on the booms below the cliffs just off to my right. And I think probably most of you have been to UBC before. I'm not sure if you've ever been to UBC on a foggy day with sea lions barking at the bottom of Wreck Beach, but there we are. So I'm going to talk about something completely different, maybe not completely different, but somewhat different than the previous presentation, and that is I want to talk about urban trees, and I want to talk about the new reality. And this is something that people are planners and landscape architects and the like are starting to wake up to. We all, I think those of us in the today in this seminar, I think I would assume most people understand that trees provide ecosystem services, and I've made a list there just to remind people if you've forgotten any of them. And some of those ecosystem services include the attraction of birds and the like. This red buckeye, which is an eastern North American species, provides the right kind of sugar-rich nectar to attract foraging hummingbirds. Like chickadees and other small birds, hummingbirds also derive considerable protein from the small arthropods that they scavenge from the leaves and twigs of trees. And that's what they've been doing lately, just outside my window, is poking around and looking for insects. Now, when we talk about biodiversity and ecosystem services in this part of the world, then we're often talking about, and trees, we're talking about bigleaf maple. It's a native species that is renowned for its support of biodiversity. The mostly unseen biodiversity is profoundly important in the functioning of forest ecosystems. And here is some of the seen biodiversity. The above ground biodiversity that you see here depends on unpolluted air, moisture availability, the presence of suitable substrates like aging bark. And this is usually a function of the age or surface chemistry of whatever it is that these epiphytes are growing on. And the mosses, lichens, and ferns are, in fact, a visible proxy for the totality of organisms that make up the ecosystem. But you have to ask, are native trees good urban trees? And I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm just going to leave that hanging for a while. Urban trees definitely provide other services. And some of those services include the really obvious things like autumn color and attractive flowers, sometimes edible fruits. But many of the services that we're now coming to recognize and we're starting to advertise are the psychological and medicinal benefits of just being around trees, the connections with human history and culture that trees provide, the increase in property values. I know talking about money uh, in a seminar like this might be not welcome, but these are sort of civic issues The intrinsic value, of course, the natural wonder of trees, is something that I think we all can recognize. And the engendering of civic pride, which is something that's maybe a little more difficult to understand. But anyway, I have some beauty shots here of some urban trees. This is a flowering cherry in Vancouver. The Vancouver Cherry Blossom Festival is something that I've been involved in. And the festival celebrates not only the beauty of cherry blossoms, but the legacy of planted cherries in nearly every neighborhood in the city. And that goes beyond the city of Vancouver, of course. And Vancouver residents of all ages and walks of life take enormous pride in this civic asset. So this is an issue that we can't just dismiss out of hand. So what is it that trees and urban trees need? It's what every gardener knows, the right plant in the right place. And I've made a list mostly for people who don't um, know most of this thing. This is actually a presentation, a kind of scaled back presentation that I gave at a conference some months ago. And clearly, trees need all of the things that are listed on the left-hand side of your screen, and a few more. Something that people, again, are starting to recognize is not only the above ground space that's required, but the below ground, that is the volume of soil that's available. And this is critically important if we are going to grow trees that are going to have any kind of drought tolerance. Another issue that people don't often think about is the appropriateness of temperatures, although we are starting to talk about heat, the effects of heat, but also the effects of cold, which are often necessary and not well understood. Certain trees just don't do well if they don't get the right amount of cold. Aftercare, which could include training and protection from physical damage, are also issues. And then down at the bottom of the screen, mulch. And this is something in the urban context, mulch is so unbelievably important that if I had failed to mention it, I would be angry at myself. So, how do we choose trees for the urban environment? So there's a list, kind of an abbreviated list on the right-hand side. Does the tree support biodiversity? Is it aesthetically pleasing? Are we making a choice between native and exotic plants? Are we looking at cultivars or are we looking at seedlings? Are we looking at the incidence of pests and diseases and what that represents? Are we looking for plants that are self-fertile, pardon me, or are they sterile? Do they have fruits? And if so, are they fleshy or are they dry? And what about climate change? What about climate change? Let's talk about climate change. So, in a future climate scenario, the depth of the snowpack and the length of the snow season is predicted to decrease. At the same time, atmospheric evaporative demand and climatic moisture deficits are going to increase. So in other words, more rain and less snow in the winter and drier in the summer with diminished natural moisture storage in our soils. This is not an insignificant issue when it comes to planting trees. It goes beyond the urban, obviously, but it's comes to a pretty fine point when we look at the urban environment. And the reason that it comes to a fine point is, and I'm sure everybody's seen this, and you have to, I have to apologize. This is, for whatever reason, this is, I guess it's an American website that lists these things. And so we have Fahrenheit degrees. I still remember Fahrenheit degrees, but those of you who don't, just think about the colors on the map. If it's green, then it's cool, and if it's red, then it's not. And you can see this is a picture from July in 2024. Sorry, this is September 5th of this year, actually. And uh, just for some background, July 2024 was the hottest July on record for the entire planet. And this was after 15 consecutive months of record-breaking temperatures across the world. So this, again, this is a picture of September the 5th, and you can see those are some pretty devastatingly hot temperatures in the urban core of Vancouver. And if you look at where I am out at UBC, this is a kind of a green and blue oasis. It's so cool in the forest of Pacific Spirit Park that it doesn't even, it barely registers. And that's what a forest does. And so anytime we can increase the forest canopy, the cooler we're going to be, and the more we're going to be able to survive with the reduced amount of water that we're going to have to contend. So I want to talk about urban trees, and I'm going to make some specific comments about urban trees. This is Acer siboldianum, which is a Japanese species. This is a picture in New Westminster. Is it a good tree? So on the plus side, it has great autumn color and small dry fruit, so it's not very messy. It's cold hardy, it's not invasive. Has a small stature, so that means you can grow it under wires. It attracts pollinators, it's pest-free, and there's very little aftercare. Basically, you plant it and walk away, it's great. But is it a good tree from another point of view? It's not particularly drought adapted. It suffers when there's reflected heat. It's intolerant of compacted soils, and it can't tolerate de-icing salts in the soils. It's verticillium wilt prone. That is particularly devastating disease of maples and other things. It has thin bark, small flowers, limited availability for in the marketplace, and it has low biodiversity because of its small stature. Okay, let's look at cultivars versus seedlings. And this is a street. This is kind of a typical street in East Van, where you have a double row, a kind of an alley of the same tree, both sides of the street, for a block or two. And this particular tree is a North American native. It's a selection of Tilia americana, the basswood. And just as a reminder for biologists in the audience who are unfamiliar with cultivated material, a cultivar is a genetically uniform named selection or hybrid that is maintained in cultivation and reproduced vegetatively. And from cultivars, we get uniform, predictable growth, but we have a fairly narrow genetic makeup and uniform susceptibility to pests and diseases. Cultivars support less biodiversity than might be found in a natural population of trees. So we can compare that with seedlings. These are red maple seedlings. This is a street. This is actually the back street where I grew up in Vancouver. Every tree on this street is different. They're all Acer rubrum, but they're all different genetically. So in most cases, seedlings are genetically variable, reflecting evolved adaptability to the range of environments they inhabit or have inhabited in the past. And in most cases, these are propagated by seed. And so we see that individual seedlings have less predictable growth. You can see that from the picture. And collectively, they have a broader genetic makeup. variable susceptibility to pests and disease. They're more attractive to biodiversity, and they have greater resilience than any single cultivar. So going back to the Tilia cultivar for a second, this is a very problematic species. In fact, most Tilia cultivars are attractive to aphids, and aphids produce honeydew, which creates property damage. Now, granted, it's not huge property damage, but it's enough property damage that people complain. It's inconvenient. People are dissatisfied, and this translates to declining support for trees, and that is the problem. Now, of course, there are ways to combat aphids because, of course, aphids, I always like to say, are nature's salad bar. They're very good, but let's not push it with a monoculture. We should not stop growing lindens or basswood. We should just not grow them crowded on streets. So here's a planting in a park. Unfortunately, it's still a clonal population, and it's covered in aphids. I know because I've checked these out. This is the Crimean linden. But this planting is also full of aphids, and who cares if the honeydew falls on the ground? Now, this is the gold tunnel at Hokkaido University in Japan, and this represents another monoculture, but some monocultures are better than others, but this is still essentially a biological desert. Still, if you look at these trees, the height and complexity of the trees contributes to summer cooling. What this does is it draws warm air from the ground into the trees and shades the ground as well. So let's talk about what makes a good tree. The best trees display desirable characteristics and tolerate a range of conditions. And what makes a bad tree? Well, this is a very, very subjective issue. Some people would consider a large tree to be a bad tree, and some would consider a large tree to be a good tree. Invasive species, I think most people would agree, are not something we want to have around. Susceptibility to pests and disease, not usually considered a good thing. But when we look at pests from a predator's point of view, pests might actually be a good thing in terms of biodiversity. A high maintenance requirement is almost always a bad thing. Excessive pollen, often a very bad thing, and limited availability makes a good tree bad. So just a couple of examples: Fraxinus angustifolia raywood, which is a very, very popular tree a couple of decades ago. In fact, it was considered a perfect tree, except that it has really, really weak branch attachments. And because it's an ash, it has susceptibility to the emerald ash borer, which, if you didn't know, has been discovered in Vancouver now. So if you don't know anything about emerald ash borer, I don't really have time to get into the details here, but it's a devastating pest. And if it becomes established in Vancouver, it will wipe out almost the entire population, urban population of ash. Guernsey elm, another perfect tree, slow growth and a really great crown habit. Unfortunately, it's susceptible to elm disease, and no nurseries carry elms anymore that are subject to elm disease. And some people call it Dutch elm disease, but I just called it elm disease because the Dutch actually had nothing to do with it. This tree, it grows very, very well. It's probably I would call it a perfect urban tree. But if we get elm disease in Vancouver, then trees like this will all die. Ginkgo biloba, another perfect tree, except that if you plant a female, then the public will complain that the seeds and the covering on the seed, which putrefies on falling to the ground, are a nuisance. Okay, so let's talk about oaks. Everybody in planners and landscape architects are very fond of saying, well, why don't we just plant oaks? And indeed, oaks are heat and drought tolerant and cold hardy, support a lot of biodiversity. They're resilient and attractive. There are lots of deciduous and evergreen species that are available. There are lots of large ones and small ones. And here are a few, including our own native Gary oak, the upper left, California black oak in the lower right, and some other North American and Asian oaks in there, some evergreen and some deciduous. But we can't plant just oaks, and we need more biodiversity, not less. We risk an awful lot with too many eggs in one basket. And these beautiful Fraxinus angustifolia, I think these are kind of sentinel species. They're mature and they're very, very attractive to the emerald ash borer. These are in Queen Elizabeth Park, and if emerald ash borer gets established, as I mentioned, then these will be among the first to go. And oaks, of course, have their own issues. Many of them grow very, very slowly, and so are not available in nurseries because of that. Armillaria root rot can be a problem. The oak leaf skeletonizer, you're looking at that here, very cute slug-like sawfly larva. Sorry, that's the oak slug. The oak leaf skeletonizer is another interesting caterpillar-like insect. Lots of galls, powdery mildew, leaf anthracnose, sudden oak death. If the climate warms, we're going to have Phytophthora ramorum here, and Mediterranean oak borer as apparently coming north. It's in Oregon now. So which trees are we going to choose? In my opinion, we have to choose trees that elicit joy and wonder, trees that are tough, and trees that aren't tough. But as long as we plant those trees in places where they're going to survive. We need to choose trees that make a viable, resilient, biodiverse urban forest. And we should remember that there are no bad trees, just bad places to put them. I think we can all agree that trees are essential in the urban environment. More trees mean more beautiful cities, and all of those things. I won't read all of these things out. You can read them. But the major point that I want to make is that we're spending a lot of time and a lot of money on trees to maintain the urban tree canopy, but we're not spending enough money or adequate resources to keep them alive. So a few points about biodiversity. We need big trees and we need small trees. We need to plant trees where they fit so that we don't have to prune them. We need to maintain a high level of diversity by planting the widest range of trees, sizes, ages, and etc. We have to think differently about pests, which are mostly just lunch for other organisms. I mean, that's not true of all pests, but it's certainly true of most. We need to think about soil biodiversity. This fly agaric, kind of a very charismatic mushroom, is a mycorrhizal species and a common associate of many cultivated and native trees. Mycorrhizal fungi are an indication of soil health and are rare in soils lacking a protective surface layer of organic matter. Remember, I talked about mulch. They are also suppressed where pesticide residues and excessive salts, including de-icing salts and fertilizer nitrogen, are present. We need more birds. That means we need to use stencils on our windows to prevent bird strikes. We need to maintain as much natural habitat as possible. But we also need to plant trees of whatever kind because birds love trees. And we need to, and this is maybe some of you understand this, but we need to drink a better cup of coffee because shade-grown coffee basically supports songbird populations, migratory songbirds. So in Central America, lots of birds overwinter and then they come back north. And if people are clearing forest to grow coffee, then those birds don't have places to breed. We need to keep cats indoors. This, I think, more than anything in the urban context, would make such a huge difference. That's my cat, Chloe. We need to assess or reassess our values. We have to understand that trees are an investment in the future, and we need to prioritize the planning and the maintenance, and indeed water for trees. I don't know, I'm probably not alone when I say that when I see a golf course green during stage 4 watering restrictions, I get a little bit perturbed. I see all kinds of urban trees dying. I think we need to water the trees that we plant and make more intelligent use of the resources that we have.
Douglas, sorry to interrupt, but we're getting a little tight on time. If you could.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's my last slide.
Oh, perfect.
Yes. So there we are.
That's a gorgeous dogwood. Thank you so much.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciated all the photos as well. And I'm sure there's a big virtual round of applause for you. Thank you so much. So we'll hold questions for Douglas till the end. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Torin.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And thank you so much, Carrina, Jill, Douglas, for your great presentations. Super happy to wrap it up. Let me just share my screen here.
And a reminder, while Torin's doing that, you can, if you think you might forget questions from the other 3 presenters, you can put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Thank you.
Perfect.
Perfect.
See that okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, hi, my name is Torin. I work for the Invasive Species Council of BC. I've been working in invasives for around 7 years. I'm super happy to be able to share a little with all of you today. I'm sure there's a lot of different variety of knowledge around invasives, but let's just jump right into it. So we're going to talk about stopping invasives before they start, some tips on site preparation and early intervention. Before I start, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across Canada where Invasive Species Council of BC works to support healthy ecosystems for all. And today I am presenting from the unceded territories of the Kwantlen and Katzie First Nations in the Fraser Valley. I'm based in Maple Ridge, so super grateful to be able to work and play where I've lived for my whole life. So just very brief on who we are. The Invasive Species Council of BC, we are been doing this for nearly 2 decades. The ISCPC has been tackling the threat of invasive species in British Columbia, and we're proud to be Canada's largest provincial invasive species charity. Our work is not confined to local borders. We focus on education, outreach, training, and collaboration across Canada and internationally. We believe that only through collective efforts can we truly reduce the spread and impacts of invasive species. And as an organization, we prioritize uniting efforts across communities, organizations, governments, and industries to drive behavior change. So the goal of this workshop The goal of this presentation is to learn the steps to stop invasive species from spreading on a project site. So we're going to be covering 7 things here: what they are, why it's important to prevent them, site preparation tips, soil management, best management practices, what to monitor, talk a little bit about early detection, rapid response, and building community support. So usually this is where I would go in and talk about all the different tools we've developed and all the different things that we have talked about in the past. But I think for the sake of this presentation, we're going to go through a bit of a case study. So throughout the workshop, we'll be referring back to this hypothetical case study as an example of these practices and how they can be implemented. So in this forest edge eco development, the issue we're running into is a small sustainable residential project on the edge of second growth forest within that coastal Douglas fir moist maritime subzone. This zone's mild climate and rich biodiversity, as I'm sure you all know, make it a very high risk for invasive species establishment, and especially after soil disturbance from construction. Our goal is to our goal of the project aims to preserve as much natural vegetation as possible while minimizing invasive species spread, protecting both the new landscape and the surrounding ecosystems. Before we can address the issues, we need to better understand what invasive species are and how we can prevent them. So as I'm sure you've all heard different terminologies for invasive species, but noxious, weedy, exotic, and whatever else is on the screen here. But ultimately, invasive species are those non-native species that cause harm, whether it's environmental harm, economic, or even social. I'm sure many of you already are familiar with the concept, so we'll briefly review the 4 characteristics that drive invasive species success. So the first one, invasive species are prolific reproducers. So whether it's plants producing thousands of seeds or animals with large frequent litters like rabbits, zebra quagga mussels produce millions of veligers per zebra quagga mussel. This is rapid reproduction allows them to establish and expand their populations quickly. The second one, they're excellent at spreading. So seeds, spores, or even small plant fragments can travel far and wide, carried by wind, water, animals, or even human activity. So all of your backcountry hiking, all of your motorcycling, all your camping, all that stuff can help move these invasive species. And this adaptability means that they're really hard to contain once they are introduced. Oh, sorry. So the third one, many invasive species thrive in disturbed environments. So that's why we're talking about stuff like construction sites, logging areas, trails through parks, and any other places with disturbed soils or vegetation create ideal conditions for them to gain that kind of initial foothold for establishment. And finally, they often lack natural predators or pathogens in their environment. And without these checks and balances, they can outcompete those native species and dominate ecosystems, kind of creating those monocultures. So, talking about the importance of prevention, prevention is the most successful, most cost-effective, and least labor-intensive method of controlling invasives. So, what is prevention? Prevention means recognizing the ways that invasive species are spread and taking action to prevent those. So, learning a little bit about vectors and pathways, which are the types of ways in which invasive species can spread. So, vectors means by which an invasive species may travel. So, those are your boats, those are your logging trucks, those are your hiking boots. So, understanding the different means of which these species can spread. And then there are pathways. So pathways are the routes in which invasive species travel. So that is the logging industry as a whole. That is moving it from Southern America to Northern Canada. That is the horticultural industry shipping plants that were grown in Ontario and bringing them to BC. So understanding these larger ways that the invasive species move is super important. Once the pathways and vectors have been identified, then action can be taken to address these methods of spread. So this could include seeding disturbed areas. So we've talked about it in the previous presentation. Super important if you do have disturbed areas that you are reseeding them, you're planting them with native vegetation to hopefully prevent these invasive species from establishing. Another one is cleaning your vehicles, cleaning your equipment when leaving areas of infestation. So a lot of the time you may have seen at the trailhead of one of your favorite parks, you might see boot brush stations. So it's important to make sure you're cleaning your boots if there are invasive species in the area, so you're preventing them from moving to that next favorite park of yours. And the last one, if you are an avid boater, removing the plug of your boat so you aren't leaving that bilge water, and there might be invasive mussels, there might be just invasive species kind of on the outside of your boat, is making sure you're cleaning your equipment. So you might have heard of the Play Clean Go, but we also work around Work Clean Go. So very simple, very similar to the Play Clean Go program. It is a prevention program aimed at reducing the spread of invasive species that occur through outdoor work activities. So some ways that you could help to prevent during your work activities: using only weed-free soils. So a lot of the time when you're working, whether you're a developer or whether you're building a garden box in your backyard, understanding that the soils you're purchasing and bringing from your local garden center could have invasive species in them. And a lot of the time, there are ways of getting those weed-free soils or gravel or any other materials that you're moving from site to site. Using a brush or a hand tool, pressure washer, anything that you can use to clean mud from your equipment, from your footwear, and preventing the movement of that soil that could have those invasive seeds or plant fragments in them. Another good way is to use certified native seed for revegetation. So if you have a restoration site and you want to supplement the disturbed soil that you've already planted native plants in, to fill in those gaps, you can use something like native seed vegetation. When you go to purchase the native seed, you can ask for a certificate of analysis, and that will give you the breakdown of how much of the seed is what kind and what likelihood there is of having invasive species in them, further preventing those invasive species from establishing if they're not already there. And site prep. So site prep is super important. Project sites are particularly vulnerable to invasions from invasive species. When the ground is disturbed, it is super easy for invasive plants to take a hold. Activity in the site can further spread these invaders to other areas of the site as well as off-site. So not only should you be concerned about invasive species moving from site to site, like the example I kind of gave about the trailhead, it also is important that you are preventing the movement of the soils or movement of the invasives from one end of the trail to the other. So knowing where everything is on your site, knowing the vectors and pathways of spread at the site should be identified at the beginning in order to contain and prevent the spread of invasive species. So the example here is, if there's an excavator on your site, there are a lot of different ways that that excavator can move soil, whether it's in the bucket, whether it is on the operator itself after they've gone out and started to look around their heavy equipment, whether it's on the tracks. So knowing the different ways that plants and material can spread can help you prevent the movement. So soil management and BMPs. BMPs, best management practices. You all might not necessarily need to know the different soil management best management practices. Excuse me. But it's important to know that there are tools developed if you ever are in a situation where you do. So knowing your legal obligations. So if you are developing or you're a part of a development, knowing your legal obligations. Before your operations start, review those provincial regulations and local bylaws, requirements, or options available where operations are taking place. So some landfills accept invasive species or soils that are potentially infested with invasive species, while others do not. And some governments have bylaws regulating the development and removal of soil or fill. So understanding what the process would be before you start moving stuff to hopefully prevent it from moving there, moving back, moving to a new spot. Knowing your soil, identify invasive species, and plan accordingly. So the most effective method of preventing the transfer of invasives is to eliminate them from the soil prior to movement. Not all the time is this a viable option, but sometimes there are only a few invasives that are in the soil, whether it's just a recent establishment of invasives and you were able to get them before they flowered and went to seed. You also might want to inspect the area by excavated and adjacent areas for evidence of invasives. So, super important before you start digging soil up is to know what is on top of the soil, because that will give you an indication what is in the soil itself. If you have a large population of, let's say, Scotch broom on top of the soil, there's a good chance there is a large seed bank. And if you do disturb the soil and you take the plants that have grown on top out, the likelihood that that Scotch broom is going to grow back is very high. So knowing what is on top can help inform you what is in the soil itself. Control it before you move it. So invasive species should be treated on site where possible. Many invasives are not controlled by a single treatment. Like I said, they may be visibly dead, but there are parts hidden underground that may still be viable, whether they're seeds or plant fragments. Move the soil responsibly, not the invasive species. So when soils are moved by dump trucks with a rock screen, the normal screen is not enough to prevent plant fragments from being freed by vibrations and wind that occur during transportation. So using stuff like heavy tarps that cover the top of the box are necessary to ensure fragments do not spread during transportation. The sides and back of the truck should also be secure so that there's no chance of soil seeds or fragments escaping. And alternate measures may need to be taken if transporting soils infested by invasive insects. So something like an emerald ash borer. I was going to note this as well. We have lots of resources on our website too about emerald ash borer if you wanted to learn more. But if you're dealing with not just invasive plants, but invasive insects, there is a whole other level of biosecurity that you need to go through. Ensuring clean equipment before and after moving infested soils. So before leaving the source site, the truck exterior and wheels should be washed thoroughly. And this is while loading. Not all the time does the dirt, not every time is it perfect. Some of the dirt might get on the outside of the vehicle and might get stuck. It might be raining. So if we prevent any soil on the outside of the vehicle that potentially falls off, when the dump truck comes back, the soil that we washed off can then be put into the back of the truck where it will not escape. If we treat invasive soils wisely, determine the best method of soil treatment. So do more than expected and always follow directions as per something, for instance, like pesticide. Not all the time are pesticides used. Not all the time should pesticides be used, but if it's the case where you are managing the plant before it leaves the site, it could make sense to use pesticide as a tool. If not, using manual removal to get a majority of the plant fragments out could be a viable option as well. And managing your source materials. So knowing before you import your soil, like I'd mentioned, it's important. Excuse me. Some water here. It's important to fill. The important of fill must include verifiable information on the source site. So you might have seen it driving up and down different highways. They'll advertise clean soil. Using clean soil is a really great way to prevent the establishment of invasive species that might not already be there. So going to places that will provide clean soil and clean soil certification is super important. And lastly, revegetate disturbed sites. So most invasive species establish on site where the soil has been disturbed and spread from there. Revegetating the site quickly or establishing an interim cover crop will likely be beneficial to either prevent the establishment of invasives or slow the establishment down so the native plants or the non-invasive plants that you planted can help to outcompete those. So lots of background. We're jumping back into the case study. So our case study, the team has followed soil management BMPs and taken preventative measures to prepare the site and mitigate the spread of invasives. They have done this through soil contaminant and storage. So to prevent the invasives from taking root in disturbed soil, the project team has stored excavated soil in covered designated areas and used barriers to prevent accidental disturbal of seeds or plant fragments. They have on-site equipment cleaning stations. So To avoid the introduction of invasive species from machinery moving from site to site, they have a cleaning station set up at the entry and exit points at all points of this site. So this is crucial as heavy equipment from nearby sites could bring in soil containing invasive seeds. The cleaning protocols under these: equipment is thoroughly cleaned before entering the site and after operating in sensitive areas, especially areas that we have noted in our pre-construction survey that are high risk for invasive. So understanding that there are areas that are more high risk that could have those invasive species moved. And the last part, so strategic planting with native vegetation. Before development begins, a ground cover of resilient native plants is established around the perimeter. These plants create a buffer zone, reducing the likelihood of invasives into spreading into forest edge once construction is underway. So we have a little diagram here. The challenge here: nearby invasive threat. The forest edge adjacent to the project is known for sporadic growth of Scotch broom and Himalayan blackberry, two invasive species that can quickly establish in disturbed areas. So the solution here: the team establishes a 10-meter buffer zone of low-maintenance native grasses and shrubs to reduce the likelihood of these invasives encroaching on the development site. Not only is it important to establish these buffers, but it's also even more important to monitor them. These buffers are not going to prevent all of the invasive species from establishing. They're going to hopefully prevent the number and lower it down to a manageable rate. So you could go in afterwards and you can maintain the invasive species, keeping them away from our new development. Monitoring. So it's key to the early detection and rapid response and control of invasive species. This involves those regular surveys before and after planting, setting up a monitoring schedule, so whatever works for you, whether it's weekly, monthly, bi-weekly, and having a database to keep records on all the monitoring to see how effective the treatments that you are doing are and whether or not things need to be adjusted. Early detection. So early detection equals early control. Regular monitoring allows for the early detection of invasive species, and with those early detections, we can go in and nip it in the bud. We can pull the invasive species out before they start to form, before they start to create a seed bank where they haven't already. And super important, what do we do once we have detected this? So planning for rapid response. There needs to be a plan in place for how to respond when invasive species are detected. The plan will likely vary depending on the invasive species and the life stage that it's detected in. Has it just gone to seed? Has it flowered? Is it just growing up? Things to consider when making the plan. So contaminate, how to stop the species from spreading off the site of where it is currently infesting, and what are the treatment options. When determining the best options, there are many things to consider, such as the size of the infestation, the location, how close is it to a sensitive area, what life stage is it in, and what type of treatment that works best for that species. So some species are okay if you just mow them from the top. Other species need to get the whole root system out. Disposal. So how to properly dispose of the plant materials without them spreading or being able to regrow. So once again, this is all about species specific. What life stage and the species can affect what the best management for disposal are. Many invasive plants spread through fragments. It can regrow if not disposed of properly. So the example we always like to give is knotweed. Knotweed can grow with a 10 millimeter plant fragment, whereas something like Himalayan blackberry would not grow with a 10 millimeter plant fragment. So understanding the plant you're dealing with will help you understand the level of disposal that you need to work with. So through this case study, routine monitoring, so that a weekly inspection protocol is established for the team to spot any invasive species attempting to establish in the disturbed area. Team members are trained to identify common invasives in the area like Scotch broom, English ivy, Himalayan blackberry, and other invaders that disturb the coastal Douglas fir zones. rapid response. If species are detected, the team is prepared with a rapid response protocol, which includes contaminated manual removal and safe disposal to prevent seeds from spreading. This immediate action saves the development from costly, large-scale invasive management and minimizes soil disturbance, aligning with the project's eco-friendly goals. One super important thing is protecting ecosystems from invasive species isn't the role of land managers, but is community effort. Community engagement can be a great way to both build relationships with people around the development and also bring invasive species awareness and get them involved in the process of preventing the spread. Fostering community support also includes the following regulations and bylaws to protect local ecosystems. So the second challenge, we'll go through this really quickly, community concerns over long-term ecosystem impact. So the community members have raised concerns about soil erosion from invasive species spread. The solution here could be the project team communicates its proactive soil management and native planting plans to local stakeholders. They share data on their invasive-free native-focused approaches, long-term cost savings, and ecological benefits. They also encourage the neighborhood support for ongoing monitoring efforts by involving the community in those early detection programs. So the developer could go in and prevent longer term costs by removing the plants initially. So it results in long-term benefits. So reduced management costs. So by preventing invasives from establishing early, the project saves a ton in the future for control costs and creating long-term budget lines so they can keep invasives from regrowing into their development. Community support and regulatory compliance. So these practices align with local regulations and beliefs on invasive species management and the environmental protection and strength of the communities standing together. And lastly, enhanced ecosystem health. So this being one of the most important parts, maintaining native vegetation and preventing invasive species improves soil health, prevents erosion, and supports biodiversity in a long-term setting, an example for eco-responsible developments in the future. Lots to cram into a little bit of time, but these are just some of the takeaways that we're hoping to kind of talk through. So identifying vectors and spread, super important. Always doing site prep, knowing what you're looking for, knowing the different invasive species in the area, protocols for monitoring and early detection, following regulations is always super important, but engaging with the community and getting their help, getting their buy-in can always help you in the long run. Thank you.